Well, what we have learned, really just, we're going to share a little bit of our story today, but what we have learned really as we have come through recovery and restoration and continue in doing that, we have found that just having some additional tools around healthy conflict and communication has been really good. So what we really love to share with you today is some of the tools that we've learned, some of the tools we continue to learn, and we just hope that we can provide some of that for you all so that you'll have some things that you can take away from this as you continue to work on a healthy coupleship.
I want to give you this number. We probably will not have time to get to a typical Q&A, but we want to get an opportunity to have questions answered. So if you want to write this number down, you can text us questions. We'll be glad to answer, because we're going to be covering a lot of material in a really, really short amount of time. And so I wanted to put that out there. So let me just real quickly.
Well, no, I was just going to say, too, if there's any slides that you just want to take a picture of, whether that's our phone number or anything like that, feel free to, that will not distract us at all.
But I need to go back and get 205-910-8973. So our story, Melody and I met in Birmingham. I know I sound like we're local, but we're not. We're from the deep south.
Y'all.
From Birmingham, Alabama. But we met in college there in Birmingham. And in this picture, our wedding day, I'm 20 years old, and Melody's 22. We had met my freshman year, married my junior year. Melody had just graduated. I think that blinks every time I step on that cord, so I'm going to try not to do that. But what Melody did not know on this particular day is about my secret. At 8 years old, I had been exposed to a stash of pornography. And that drastically impacted my life. But growing up in a small town, I had grown up in church, and Melody will talk a little bit about her philosophy of life. Mine was mine was to know better is to do better. And so knowing better, I knew pornography was wrong, but knowing it was wrong was not equating to better behavior. I wasn't able just to will it away through discipline and effort and just bootstraps kind of thing. And so on my wedding day here, Melody didn't know about that secret. And there's really two main reasons I did not tell her. Number one is I knew she loved who she thought I was. I did not know she'd love who I really was. The second reason is I thought marriage was going to fix it. And that's the common myth that many of the men in our ministry believe. And when marriage didn't fix it, it took my shame, that we're going to talk about later, took it to a deeper level as well. So growing up, the best way really to understand my life is having that exposure when I was 8, living in a small town, trying to be all things for all people. I'd heard, like Melody did growing up in her church, you may be the only Jesus some people may ever see, so just a lot of pressure to perform and look the part and to quote-unquote be a good witness. And so that meant anything that was negative, anything that was not the most stellar, you kept that secret. So the best way to illustrate that maybe is like the kids at the pool in the summertime. When they take a beach ball and they see how long they can hold it underwater. Maybe you've seen kids do this. Maybe you did it when you were a kid. Everybody knows it's a funny game because at some point, the beach ball is going to come shooting to the surface with a lot of force and a lot of energy, right? And so my whole growing up years, I started preaching at 15, so then I had my own reputation to manage. Met Melody. She sang, I preach, we're going to save the world. And so at 20, the same year I get married, we also planted a church. So soon after that, my parents joined the church. So I'm my parents' pastor. My youth director, the closest thing to an older brother growing up that I had, became my worship pastor. So I tell you that because the beach ball kept getting bigger. And so much of my energy and effort went into maintaining the reputation, looking the part, and making sure nobody knew anything that was not looking the part.
Well, and I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and my dad was a minister. So Trey and I meet at this, Christian college university. He's in ministry. We're pastoring. We're basically at a church doing ministry. And so I really, again, I would never have verbalized this, but I really think deep down my belief was good choices plus the pursuit of God equals a perfect life. And so I'm going to marry this guy. We're going to do ministry together, and life is just going to be perfect, and we're going to live happily ever after. Never did I know that Trey, coming into marriage, was struggling with any kind of secret.
And a lot of times people think that pornography doesn't really have an impact on anybody. It's just pornography. We hear that a lot. What's the big deal? Who's it hurting? And we always put this picture in our slide deck because I want you to see these were the ages of our children when my beach ball came shooting to the surface. About 10 years into marriage, we had children, you can see, as young as 6 months. And it greatly impacted their life. It greatly impacted Melody's life, obviously, and ultimately led to our divorce. And we are grateful and so thankful. As in the introduction, we refer to God's grace often as a scandal. For me, when grace quits being a scandal, I know that I'm thinking too highly of myself, right? We are so grateful for the transforming power of His grace in our lives because we both were trying so hard to change ourselves on the outside. But I have a good friend who's been on our podcast, Undone, Redone podcast, a number of times. His name is Chad Bird. And he says, God's chosen material to work with is nothing. Think about the beauty you guys have the opportunity of seeing all the time. You probably just begin to take it for granted after a while. I mean, this is absolutely
driving
gorgeous.
over here yesterday, we're just like, it doesn't matter how many times we come to Utah, we're just like, this is unbelievable. It's just so beautiful.
But He created all that out of nothing. And He has a way in our own lives of bringing us to nothing so that He can do in us what He really wants to do. His chosen material is nothing. Our ministry, Undone, Redone. I was fighting being undone. It was painful. And my view, my belief system was basically good Christians have it together. There is no pain. If you're doing it right, there's no pain. It's smooth sailing. There's no conflict. And so when I was experiencing those things, I incorrectly believed, here's my proof that I am flawed. Here's my proof that I don't measure up. But nobody can know that, so that was something else that I had to stuff down. Right? So a big part of what we want to do today, if nothing else, is just debunk some of these myths. But we're grateful because of some of the things we learned apart for 6 years. We were able to come together. This was October of 2008. It was a beautiful day in our story, obviously, as we were reconciled and remarried there. Our children growing up there, and they continue to grow up. We are now empty nesters. And some of you, I don't know if you've ever seen a film that came out in 2017 called The Heart of Man. Our story was a part of that film, and we had the opportunity to go to LA for the red carpet. And it was just a very redemptive moment for us to really celebrate what God has done and continues to do in our relationship.
But even, I would say, stepping back into a relationship with one another, we both came from different homes, where communication or conflict was handled a certain way, marriage and relationship was handled a certain way, parenting is handled a certain way. And so we naturally step back into this, and we don't realize that some of the conflict is just that we came from handling things different ways. So what we, again, hope as we step back into this, that we can begin to communicate about what did it look like for us growing up, but then also what do we want? We want to move away from surviving and into a thriving relationship and a thriving coupleship. And just as it relates to trauma, if you are a betrayed spouse out there, many times you're going to circle back around to triggers, and you're going to circle back around to things where it may feel like the old thing. And so we've got to really take into that perspective of what is happening, and is it the same old, or is this a new experience that feels like the same old? And so there's just all kinds of dynamics that can impact the relationship. So we want, again, as we're talking about conflict and how we handle it, we also want to address shame and how that can present itself in the relationship.
Yeah, but also as it relates to trauma, a big thing that we see in our relationship, especially in most of the people that we work with are they're people of faith. They've grown up in the church. And that's why sometimes it's like God is blowing up their paradigms in a lot of ways. But a big piece is getting them to be honest about the trauma and helping them understand what betrayal trauma is all about, and so that they can begin to give themselves the space for healing. Because sometimes in the church we can say, well, that happened emotionally. I just need to be beyond that. I just need to get over that, right? And sometimes we try to sweep these very, very painful things under the rug. And the problem is when we've done that maybe since childhood, now as adults we're going through life with all this woundedness that has not really been dealt with. and we're the walking wounded, and God wants to bring healing. And that was certainly a truth of our stories, that we were really kind of looking to each other to bring that healing. And as we'll talk about, that became enmeshment. But let's look at some myths that are common as it relates to marriage. Number one, a common myth: my spouse should meet all of my needs. Right? Maybe you've seen a movie. I'm kind of dating myself. Some of you may be not old enough to remember the movie. Jerry Maguire with Tom Cruise and Cuba Gooding Jr. The whole "you complete me" scene, you had me at hello, that made for Hollywood scene, And sometimes when there's conflict in our marriage, we can have this idea: if I'd only had somebody that completed me. We're having this conflict, so maybe this is my proof that my spouse just does not complete me. They just don't get me. And we start maybe having this discord there. Another common myth in marriage that maybe you can relate to is that good marriages don't have conflict. Hopefully you don't believe
That's
that.
definitely something that I had coming into this.
But you came into this session, so hopefully you don't have that myth. But some of us maybe, if we're honest, maybe bought into that lie. Especially Christian people, right, who love God, and our purpose is to save the world and to be a good witness. Certainly conflict is not going to be a good witness, so we can't have conflict. And so that added to a lot of what I was stuffing, to cover up, because we were having conflict, but instead of just allowing the conflict to happen. Here's one way to think about it. Proverbs talks about iron sharpening iron. When iron is sharpening iron, sparks are flying, right? I was a passive nice guy in the relationship, trying to be a marshmallow in the relationship. I come to tell you, marshmallows do not sharpen marshmallows. All right? And so when it comes to healthy conflict, think about it as it relates to iron sharpening iron. Right? Yes, there may be sparks flying, but that's when we're beginning to steward the conflict, both benefit. The coupleship benefits. The people around us benefit when we steward conflict well.
Well, and I would say that, many times I think just growing up in the church, there's kind of this, be a passive nice guy. And then when you get married, a passive nice guy can feel like nailing Jell-O to the wall. And I think women, it really created insecurity in me, whereas I really wanted somebody to kind of butt up to. I wanted somebody to challenge me, from time to time. And so
you were looking for the sparks.
I was looking for the spark, yes.
Yes. And I was not giving her that, because I thought that I got to avoid the sparks, right? And so and again, we share, and yours may be different, but what we want to get to is that we often bring these preconceptions into marriage that are our core beliefs, and that is our truth. And if those things never get challenged, maybe as falsities, then often we're trying to make our marriage work, but it's really kind of built on a foundation that's flawed. Another myth that many believe: if I marry the right person, my life will be complete. Kind of another way of saying some of the other myths, perhaps. And so what that keeps us doing, though, is instead of looking inward, is that we're looking for things outside of us, people outside of us, circumstances outside of us, to make life work, right? And that's part of our broken state as well. But a lot of what that comes to is this common misconception that many people have, that clinically is referred to as enmeshment. Do we have any therapists in the room? Anybody therapists? Okay. So he can hopefully back us up that enmeshment we thought was a healthy thing, right? Yeah. Matter of fact, I don't know if y'all have this in y'all's ceremonies out here. At our wedding ceremony, our first wedding, we had a unity candle. Do y'all know unity candles? Is that part of maybe wedding? Maybe it used to be. Maybe I'm dating myself again. But anyway, the way a unity candle worked is that when they lit all the candles pre-ceremony, they left one candle on the unity candle table unlit. So 2 were lit, 1 was unlit. And at some point in the ceremony, the bride and groom would walk over and they would grab each other's individual candle. They would light the unity candle, signifying the 2 becoming one, as Scripture says. But then often what they would do, which I would say is a mistake, they would then blow out the individual candle and put it back in the candle holder, right? Now, it's great 2 become one, but the thing there, they need to leave the candles lit, because we're still 2 individual people. We don't just lose ourselves in the relationship. So to illustrate that, so let's look at this. We've got 2 people coming together, and we incorrectly thought The two shall become one. We just need to lose ourselves in this relationship. If we've married the right person, if we found somebody that completes us, then we're good to go, right? So, communication shouldn't be hard. It's almost like we just become this symbiotic, organism that, we're just kind of reading each other's mind, right? And sometimes then when communication is hard, and this is our core belief of what relationships should be like, the enemy's whispering, see, you just didn't marry the right person. See, if you just have somebody that really understands you, then you're good. Right. But really this is enmeshment. It's a very unhealthy thing. And so many of the relationships that we work with, a big part of our work when we first meet them in crisis is to help them come apart, to find their footing individually, so that then they can then re-look at the relationship through a new lens.
Yeah, and it's not from a place of being punitive. It's really more, if the betrayed spouse has got to do the work to heal, and then the spouse that is struggling has got to do the deeper work to get to the roots to find out what's contributing to that behavior. Whereas if we just keep them together, there's all this ongoing little t traumas that are beginning to happen. So we really believe in individual restoration, making that coupleship a lot stronger than when they come back together.
So what we've learned about marriage is that it's not a day at the beach, but a mountain climb. Now again, all these illustrations really,
which in reality we really do like a day at the beach, right?
Yeah, which I've got some beautiful mountains
That's
here
right.
as well. But if you know anything about climbing a mountain, it's hard.
Yeah.
My son and I did Mount Elbert and his coming of age when he graduated high school, my oldest son, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And as a matter of fact, I have a son who he chose a cruise, but on the way up this mountain 3 years before, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I got to do this again in 3 years, But I finally made it to the top. So glad I did. But that's where it's a mountain climb, and there's these great scenic views at times. But then there's another climb, and we have another season of climbing. And if we're looking for marriage to be a day at the beach, then we're going to be really unsatisfied. But we also realize that God uses marriage as a part of His sanctifying process. And let me say it this way. We all know marriage is hard. Anybody not know marriage is hard? Okay, if you say that.
We always say that marriage just puts your problems on steroids.
Yeah, it doesn't fix problems, it puts problems that we have on steroids. But it's not only it's hard, we believe, and this is one thing I want you to take away if you don't get anything else out of this, we believe marriage is difficult by design. That God uniquely creates the relationship between the husband and wife to bubble up things in us that He wants to change and transform. And He uses our spouse as a part of that sanctifying process. Now, here's the thing. Knowing what you know about our story, I come into marriage, I've got this secret. I got this beach ball that keeps getting bigger. I planted a church. I'm now pastor of my parents. How crazy is that? And so this beach ball keeps getting bigger. I get married. I'm expecting Melody to complete me, right? I'm also wanting true intimacy to be known, we'll talk about. But yet I've got all these secrets. She can't know me because I'm withholding a big part of me, right? Out of my fear. As I said, I knew she loved who she thought I was. She loved the mask. But the problem about wearing mask is only the mask gets loved. And there's a deep insecurity behind that. And the other problem with mask, that many of you maybe can relate to, is that we wind up spending all of our energy comparing our worst with everybody else's highlight reel. Right? Even as a couple, we can compare our worst as a couple with everybody else's couple highlight reel. And social media makes it very easy to see today everybody's highlight reel. And so but now I come into marriage, I didn't have this perspective, but God was actually using Melody to bubble up stuff in me. He didn't want all that stuff hidden. He wanted to bring it to the surface. He was trying to undo me. Well, I was trying to keep it all hidden. So here, she's that instrument God is using. So in my immaturity, all I knew is if she would just stop, I'm good. If she would just let me hide, I'm good. Well, God didn't want to let me hide. He wanted to bring about a true healing and bring true freedom. And so we'll get to intimacy in a minute, but part of that is making sure that we're known. And that means being vulnerable and telling the truth. But God uses marriage as a part of His sanctifying process that's difficult by design. So let's contrast what we described as enmeshment with this concept of differentiation. Okay? This kind of coming apart. We talked about, we work with couples. Sometimes we do a healing separation with a couple. Healing separation because they need a separation so that they have the best chance of getting to what we refer to as the new normal. Because if they just try to go another chapter and verse from the same preconceptions and the same understanding of marriage they start with, then it's probably going to fail. They need a new normal, a new lens with which to see the world. And so differentiation is two people who know who they are choosing the relationship. You see, the first 11 years of our marriage, when we first got married, I did not know who I was as a man. My father did not help me answer that question. Give him grace. His father didn't help him answer the question. His father, my grandfather, died when he was in college. I believe that masculinity is bestowed, that it takes a man to draw out a man. My father didn't help me do that, so I had this big question, who am I as a man? And so what I was doing is I was taking that question to Melody, demanding subconsciously that she tell me that I had what it took as a man. Now here's the problem with that. She was trying to be the Proverbs 31 woman, and she just kind of added that to the list. Okay, help your husband feel like a man. That must be in there somewhere in Proverbs 31 woman. And bless her heart, she tried. But she was not designed to help me know my true identity. There's no human on the planet that can speak to our identity. Only God can call it. Think about Christ. At His baptism, there was an audible voice, the Father. This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. That was before He did any ministry. That was His true identity. And so when I was coming to Melody and she was trying, but she couldn't, then I would run to more pornography because I needed a female to validate who I was as a man. And so for me, after the divorce, it was a forced differentiation because we were forced apart, right? And then I had to do the painful work of really knowing who I was. That started in learning how to be intimate and known in the company of other men. Now certainly, when I'm saying intimate, I'm not talking about sex. Unfortunately, in our culture, when we hear the word intimacy, we immediately think sex. Sex is a type of intimacy, but it's not true intimacy. Intimacy is being known. If anything, sex is a celebration of that true connection and intimacy. But I didn't know who I was, and I had to discover who I was. And so me now knowing who I was as a man, now I could come back not needing a relationship like I did before, but now still wanting a relationship, but also had been single long enough to realize, hey, I'm okay individually, that if I'm never married, I want to be married, I think I was built for a relationship, but if I'm single for the rest of my life, I'd come to the realization that God was enough. So while I still wanted a relationship, the switch was I no longer needed a relationship. You see, enmeshed people need the spouse to come through for them. What we want is healthy differentiation. And so that's why, guys, as Melody was talking about earlier, doing our own work is so important to a healthy marriage.
So when we've got that identity, so when you think of differentiation, and sometimes, Trey, we have the arrows side by side, but also up and down. So I'm getting my identity in Christ, in God, but then I now get to take that. I get to take that feminine strength that the Lord gives me, and Trey gets to take that masculine strength that he gets from God, and we now bring it to the relationship. The other piece that's really, really important here is that we have healing community outside of our covenant marriage, okay? And what that looks like for me is that's other women. That's not me in relationship with other men and women. That is healing community where on a day, and we know that we're going to struggle with this, there's going to be a day where I'm like, you know what? I know that God loves me, but I don't feel it today. And now I can take that concern, or I can take my anxiety, or I can take my stress, whatever that looks like, to some of these ladies who love me well and walk with me. And I don't have to try to just power up. I can actually say, you know what, today I'm having a really hard day. And then they can remind me of my truth, and they can remind me of that identity. And now, again, I'm not running to Trey trying to suck the life out of him. I'm able to process that in community with other women, and now I get to bring that. That's why it's so, so important that we have community, because shame loves to communicate the message to us that we're not worthy of love and belonging. And shame, really the definition of that, guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame loves to focus on the person, whereas guilt is more the behavior. Shame is more on the person. I am a mistake. There's something fundamentally flawed about me that if they know this about me, they're going to run for the hills. And so 3 things is really where shame loves to thrive. That's silence, secrecy, and isolation. Think about it. Think about some of the most community, the most just awesome times that you have with friends or family or whatever, you're not usually hearing a voice of shame at that time, right? We usually hear a voice of shame, maybe if something's happened, maybe we've had an argument or we're having a bad day and we're all alone and isolated. That's where we begin to hear the narrative of shame. And the beauty of healing community is so the antidote of shame, which is isolation, silence, and secrecy, is showing up and sharing our stories with others in the context of community. So that is the antidote for shame, and that's, again, the purpose of healing community. So now I can bring those things that I've processed with others and getting my needs met with God, and now I can be fully known in relationship with Trey.
So what we long for is intimacy. We were created for intimacy.
Right.
We were created by a God who's never existed outside of community to live in community, right? Into me see. You see, coming into marriage, I longed for intimacy. I longed to be known. But as I shared, there was a big secret, that whole beach ball thing, that I didn't let Melody in on that. So I was robbing our relationship from the very beginning of true intimacy because I was withholding a part of who I was. And that was out of fear. That was out of not wanting to be vulnerable. Well, guys, let me say it this way. You can't have intimacy without vulnerability. Okay, we want that. We wish that would be different because we wish we could demand intimacy and still stay in our protected bunker, right? And you see, a lot of our protective means, guys, it happened before we met our spouse. There's a lot of things that happened in our growing up years that maybe should have never happened. Trauma, maybe abuse. There were maybe some very horrific things, maybe some bullying, things that we had and learned as a kid how to cope with. But many people now, they show up and they're so focused on their marriage, but they've not done the individual work of healing. So think about it this way. It's like we have these wounds and then we protect ourselves from these harmful things because we don't want to be hurt again. And so we become like porcupines. Like we protected that little, very vulnerable spot with this protected layer. And now we're showing up in our relationship with all these layers upon layers of these quills and that have served us well to protect us. But now we're in marriage and we long to be known and intimate, and we wonder, wait, why can't our spouse just know us when we're refusing to let go of all these protective mechanisms? Because as a kid, that may have served us well, but what served us well as a child can become a prison as an adult. And so as you're looking at your relationship, and you came into this session about healthy conflict, guys, we believe a healthy marriage is made up of two healthy individuals. You've got to do the individual work of understanding your own shame narrative, understanding your own ways that you protect yourself, understand the own ways maybe you keep the world at arm's length and have done that maybe since maybe things have happened in your family of origin. Because to have intimacy, you've got to know that, and that's what really helped with us. It helped that we did this after our divorce, learned that about ourselves, then we began to show up together. That's what made reconciliation possible. It wasn't a chapter 2 of the same relationship. It was truly something brand new, right? Because we began to experience the work that we had done individually and the transformation that God had brought about, that true intimacy could be a possibility. So we're going to look at now the 4 horsemen. And how much time are we looking at? 10 after. All right. So about 20 minutes roughly, something like that? 15. Okay. I'm sorry. Can't tell time in Alabama. So the 4 horsemen. This is from a book by John Gottman, The 7 Principles for Making Marriages Work, or Making Marriage Work. Maybe y'all have heard of Gottman. Somebody at the last session said he was going to be in Salt Lake, I think, maybe next week. But does a lot of great work on marriage. And so he came up with what he called the 4 horsemen. And we're just going to go through those. Now, some of you are flipping through this handout. And you're like, how in the world is this guy from Alabama who talks really slow anyway, going to get through all this? And we're not, okay? So just know that a lot of this is for you to take back and with your spouse to work through some of this. We just want to hit the highlights of these principles. So the first horseman.
Yeah, the first horseman is criticism, and criticism includes blame and general character assassination. To turn any complaint into criticism, the question is, what's wrong with you? And if you want to take a picture of these, you have some blanks on your handouts, and so those blanks, the purpose of the slide is so that you'll be able to have the answers for those. So criticism includes blame and general character assassination.
So the second horseman that Gottman came up with is contempt. And what basically contempt conveys is disgust. It includes sarcasm and cynicism, name-calling, eye-rolling, sneering, mockery, and hostile humor. Now, just as you hear me describe that contempt, how does that differ from the intimacy that we're longing for, the intimacy of being known, right? Yeah. When you're calling somebody a name, you see how that's part of that porcupine, protect myself. Name-calling is not really winning a friend or winning a very intimate spouse, right? So that's the second horseman, contempt. The third one is defensiveness. Defensiveness is a way of blaming your partner, saying basically the problem isn't me, it's you. Now, one thing we need to talk about as it relates to these horsemen is this idea of tit for tat in the relationship. When we've got a scorecard, here's the principle we want you to take. If one is fighting to go one up in the relationship and their spouse, that means they have to go one down. When one goes one up and one goes one down, the relationship loses. Here's the truth. Because the gospel is true, that we are loved as we are, as the broken men and women that we are, we don't have to perform for approval. Therefore, we don't have to get defensive. We can own our brokenness. We can own our stuff. But here's the thing. Our stuff is going to show up differently than our spouse. So what we want to do, instead of seeing that God is using our spouse to sanctify us, we get angry and we just want to point the spotlight on their stuff and minimize our stuff. And it gets this back and forth tit for tat. Maybe you're great at keeping a clean house and he wants to talk about how much money he's making to provide for the household. So you can go one up at home and he goes one up at work, and it's this never-ending tit for tat, and maybe that's where you find yourself in your relationship, and certainly defensiveness is often a big part of that. The fourth horseman is stonewalling.
Yeah, stonewalling happens when one partner tunes out. And, sometimes you might even see like somebody's checked out. It's like you're staring at somebody, but there's nobody home. And really, a lot of stonewalling is withdrawing. So again, the more identity work that we can do, the more I can step in and I can begin to own what's going on instead of run into some of these horsemen.
Yeah, and think about these. In your handout, there are checklists. Now, avoid this. This is not a good intimacy builder. If you're trying to fill out the blanks for your spouse, probably not a good idea. But here's the thing. Let's be honest. It's easy to do this, these checklists for our spouse. We know when they're critical. We know when they're defensive, right? We know when all this is happening. But I would encourage you, take the time to really do an honest self-assessment. Again, we don't have to be defensive. We're all broken. It's okay to own our brokenness. When do I show contempt? Or when am I critical? Or when am I stonewalling? When am I getting defensive? And then I would encourage you, maybe plan an intentional time to sit down, you and your spouse, and go over those. Just talk about those and see what might come to the surface just by
and maybe even look under the hood at what is contributing to that. If I'm telling on myself, sometimes when I'm in a place of fear and anxiety, it's a lot easier for me to go into a place of critical. You this, you that, instead of, man, I've got some real anxiety about this. Because when I can be honest and open with that and talk about what I'm struggling with, he naturally is going to walk toward me. If I'm blaming him or I'm critical of him, it's naturally going to create some defensiveness. So again, as we're stepping into, we desire a relationship where we're known, where we're thriving. Now I can say, okay, I want to own this because really my desire, my goal is intimacy with my spouse. And so I want to own this and step into this. And usually it's met with, wow, Mel, tell me about that anxiety. And so again, now he can step into a place of empathy with me instead of us running to these four horsemen and being critical or defensive or whichever one that we can default to.
So very quickly, in the time we have left, let's look at some of the antidotes for these horsemen. So the antidote for criticism would be, you always talk about yourself. You're so selfish. Notice the you statements that puts the person, kind of almost driving them away. The antidote, I'm feeling left out by our talk tonight. Can we please talk about my day? It starts with an I statement, right? Because we can't argue with another person's feelings, right? That's how they feel. So if we start the conversation with how they feel, we're usually in a better position. So an antidote for contempt. So first of all, contempt would be, you're an idiot. All right, pretty contemptuous, right? Name calling. The antidote, I'm proud of the way you handled that teacher conference, right? And maybe at least finding something that we can offer something positive about. So the antidote for defensiveness, it's not my fault that we're always late, it's your fault. The antidote, well, part of this is my problem. I need to think more about time. And again, just, man, if we can get rid of the scorecard in our relationship and stop the tit for tat, trying to be one up or one down, because that kind of keeps us in this anti-intimacy thing. Because we may have lost that argument, but now I'm feeling one down, and I certainly don't feel very intimate with my wife, right? I don't feel very connected because she just made me feel one down. Or maybe I'm one up, and I just put her down. But guess what? It's very lonely being one up. We're wanting deep connection, not to be alone at a one up or one down position, right? So that's the antidote for defensiveness. So stonewalling, the antidote there is to begin to self-soothe and ask yourself what's behind the desire to withdraw. Now that term self-soothing might be new. I know we've got a therapist here that probably has helped some folks learn how to self-soothe. And that's part of that is developing some emotional resiliency. And guys, I didn't have that. I had a lot of resiliency to physical pain. I was an athlete growing up. I had an appendectomy that my pain tolerance to the point that I wasn't responding the way they thought to the pain as an 8th grader. And so they waited another whole day before they took out my appendix, and it almost ruptured in that time. So I had a very high tolerance to physical pain, but absolutely zero tolerance for emotional pain. And so a lot of my work is beginning to develop an emotional resiliency that allowed me not just to have to retreat or get away when things were...
Well, and just an example of this, like when you're talking about emotional resiliency, some of the ladies that I'm walking with and coaching right now, as they're doing some work and as they're looking under the hood as to processing some of the emotions, I love to tell them, why don't you journal about that? And then they'll say, well, can I talk to my husband about that? And I'm like, why don't you journal about this and sit on it for a day or two? There's beauty in sitting in something and sitting in the tension and bringing God in and processing it and then bringing it to your spouse. So it's not if you bring it, sometimes it's when you bring it. And I know for me personally, when I've had an opportunity to process something, pray about it, maybe even speak to a girlfriend about it, then when I can bring something that's really important to Trey after some of that, a lot of the emotions are already out of it. And when emotions are high, that's naturally where we can default to some of these horsemen.
So an exercise I would encourage y'all, take your checklist, get a time set aside, plan it, and share your checklist with each other. And so just real quickly now, we're going to go through some of the resources that we can provide. We're going to be around. We'd love to meet you guys. We'd love to get to know you. I think one of the slides has our email address. We also have cards up here. We're going to be at our booth. We encourage you to come by there. But real quickly, some of the resources. We do a 4-day intensive for men in Alabama. It's in Talladega, Alabama. We don't do anything with the Speedway, but we will be close to the Speedway. But we've had guys from Utah come to our Embark Intensive over the years, so we love our partnership with UCAP and being able to come and be a part of these. But that may be something you're interested in. We've got some flyers at our booth. Also, Melody has a course for women who have experienced betrayal trauma. It's called Life Beyond Betrayal. You can go find that at lifebeyondbetrayal.com. It's a 30-day course in the community and fellowship of other women who've experienced the same thing.
Actually, it used to be 30 days. Now we made it 30 modules, and that way you can have it as long as you want it.
Yeah, we had some folks feeling tension they weren't getting through it quick enough.
Yeah.
You may just want some other resources. We've got a page up on our website, undoneredone.com/hope. When the Ashley Madison thing happened a number of years ago, we put this together because we had people, hey, I've got a friend who was on the list. So this is just still a lot of the resources that we had for counselors, therapists, parents, all of that. Also, I mentioned earlier, I think our podcast, we just got out on Pandora. Pandora just opened up the podcast as well. Spotify, Apple Podcast Player, iTunes, pretty much wherever, iHeartRadio, wherever you find podcasts, you should be able to find Undone Redone. I encourage you, if you want to go into the depths of our story, episode 32 is called Our Divorce Did Not Work Out, and that's our whole our whole story, about a little over an hour of that. We also
We've
have a
we've podcasted a lot of great people from around Utah. Christian Jensen's on that. Clay with Fight the New Drug is on that.
Yeah,
So
John
there's just a lot of
Hawkins.
great people that we've had the opportunity to interview.
Yeah, we also have about 3 or 4 years now, we've been doing videos also of our podcast. We have a YouTube channel you can find as well. We'll try to do one every week. And then here's our email addresses where you can get in touch with us. I know we didn't have time for Q&A, but I hope that you will take that 205-910-8973 number and go ahead and text us. Do come by our booth. We'd love to meet you guys, and just I'm so grateful about being a part of this, and just so thankful to UCAP and the great work that this incredible organization is doing for so many. So thank you guys.